Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM. And if you don't live within that bandwidth, you can listen streaming at ksfr.org, so you can get it anywhere in the world. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I'll be speaking with Dr. Eric Greigo Montoya, former New Mexico State Senator, former candidate for U.S. Congress, and one of the co-founders of New Mexico's chapter of the Working Families Party. He has just completed his dissertation focused on cooperative work structures, and we will be talking about his coming Zoom panel conversation with a handful of national and international leaders in the worker cooperative movement. So Eric and I will have plenty to talk about. We'll get to Eric in just a minute, but first, a few short announcements. Last week, I interviewed Robert Jensen, an author, blogger, and environmental activist. With Wes Jackson, he is the co-author of An Inconvenient Apocalypse, Environmental Collapse, Climate Crisis, and the Fate of Humanity. It's not a comedy. And he publishes a most compelling and personal blog on his experience of our unfolding climate crisis. It was a truly remarkable interview and conversation. I highly recommend you go and check it out. The week prior rather, I interviewed an Israeli-American author, podcaster, and advocate for Palestinian justice, Miko Peled. And he was visiting from New Mexico from Israel, speaking about the Palestinian crisis and how he was raised as in an Israeli Zionist family with an Israeli general father, and yet emerged to oppose the apartheid state in Israel. That conversation was also rich. And so I want to remind you that if you're listening to this show while driving around town and miss any of it, you can watch this show and any of those past shows on our YouTube recordings that are located at retakeourdemocracy.org. If you look to the lower right side of the homepage, there's a Retake on the Radio button. Just click on that, and all of our radio shows are listed in chronological order, and you can watch any of them. Watching radio, how fun. I want to remind you, oh, wait a minute. Got one more thing I got to tell you about real quick. I'm going to staple the pages together. Sometimes you can't turn it. Before we get started, I also want to acknowledge that we are conducting the show on stolen Tewa land, and we need to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of that land. We need to learn from their care for the land, air, and water, and we better do so soon. So thank you to them. Well, welcome, Eric. It's been probably over a year since I've had you on the show. How are you?
It's great. It's good to see you, Paul. It's been too long, but we're zooming here, so I can see you as well as hear you. I know they can't see us on the radio, but you're looking well, and I'm really happy that you're still at it, hard at it. It's been a crazy year, to say the least.
Well, it seems like we say that every year. I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about you take a couple of minutes and tell us who you are, how your activism has shifted over the decades, and how you became interested in cooperatives as a workforce framework.
Sure. Well, I'm a native Albuquerquean, grew up in the Burles neighborhood here in downtown Albuquerque area. And kind of went off to school and studied public policy on the East Coast, and then worked in DC for a while, and really got involved early in my career in international labor standards and labor rights. I was a presidential fellow for a few agencies, and I tried to work on how the U.S. international trade policy and economic policy could balance, environmental and labor standards with our values around sort of not necessarily free market capitalism, but this idea that if we were for increasing economic activity globally, how do we do that in a way that reflected our values? So my first lessons were frankly around the NAFTA back in the day, and I worked on try to green it up and blue it up, and meaning trying to get to these side agreements that again would reflect our values of protecting labor rights and environmental standards. It was a big political lesson for me because we even though Clinton was president, it didn't go as well as we had hoped, and the agreements ended up being not as strong as we had hoped. And so anyway, that was my first sort of foray into into not just policy, but worker rights, environmental standards and rights. And so when I moved back home to New Mexico a few years later, I got involved at the local level. I ran for city council and sort of really worked on trying to change the way the city was looking at our growth as a city, things like affordable housing, and so I continued to sort of at a much more local
They
scale
could
to
sure
try to
use
promote.
you on the city council.
What's that?
I said they could sure use you on the city
Oh
council.
yeah, so it's a very different council. I was on council with with Martin Heinrich and Debbie O'Malley and some good Democrats, and we moved a pretty progressive agenda. We got a lot done, minimum wage increase and so on, and the council's not quite as progressive as it used to be when I was up there. Anyway, as you know, I after that I went and was proud to help lead New Mexico Voices for Children, which has been a kind of in the trenches on social justice, especially around children and families for the last almost 30 years now. And then was in the state Senate, as you know, and tried to champion a lot of the same issues, fighting for a more just economy, fighting for opportunities for all kids, regardless of where they came from and their backgrounds. And then, of course, trying to figure out how we build an economy that's much more inclusive and democratic. As you mentioned, I ran for Congress on much the same platform. Came up a little short to a pretty formidable opponent who's now governor. And then after that, I really decided to go back and finish a dissertation or a PhD that I had started earlier in my life. And so spent the last few years trying to get that done, teaching, doing some research around the social capital, social justice, and how that relates to the economy. And at the same time, as you mentioned, tried to get the Working Families Party off the ground, which we were successful in doing. And thanks to your work and a lot of partners, I think we changed the legislature a lot by doing some good campaign work and getting some good people elected and getting rid of some folks who are more problematic in terms of our values. And so, so after finishing last year, I taught a little, and then I took some time. I thought it'd be good to come back. So I've been working with the city of Albuquerque for the last year and a half, trying to advance affordable housing here in Albuquerque, address some of our economic and social and our challenges that I know Santa Fe and other cities have the same challenges around the unhoused population, and what does it look like to have a much more balanced public safety strategy. And so I've been trying to help Mayor Keller with some of that, and been really pleased to be part of kind of making my hometown a little bit more inclusive and hopefully more diverse in terms of how we approach economic development and housing and really kind of stick to our values. So it's kind of full circle. I started out here and I'm back where I started in some ways.
Okay. Well, you've got your hands full with as moderator of what looks like a very interesting panel on April 13th. The Latin American and Iberian Institute is hosting a virtual panel focused on the social and solidarity economy movement, perspectives from US, Spain, and Latin America. And you're going to be moderating the panel. Can you fill in our listeners as to who the Latin American and Iberian Institute is and their interest in and involvement in the social and solidarity economic movement? Perhaps start by telling us a bit about that movement and then turn to the Institute.
Sure. So, the social solidarity economy movement, SSE, is, internationally, it's much more sort of well known, and it's not just in practice, but also in not just in academic circles, but certainly a lot of elected officials and advocates know that it's really an attempt to push back on the dominant sort of neoclassical capitalist mindset that the U.S. has kind of championed over the past century for sure, but to really inject a much more social and sort of justice-based inclusive model of how we govern ourselves, from local governments, city government, to certainly state and national governments, and certainly what does the international economy and look like, and how do we make sure that it's not a group of elites sort of running things, regardless of what party they are, but how do we make sure that the the electorate, the citizenry, is much more engaged in making every decision, from what kind of economy we want to issues like affordable housing to what we want to do even at the local level around climate justice, around protecting our environment. So it's an international movement. Frankly, it's been around for many decades, and is well known in most of the world, certainly in Europe. Less well known here in the U.S., although we have some really great groups who've been working on it for a while. It's most identified with, I think, the most common examples of ways that the social and solidarity economy sort of are manifest. You mentioned worker cooperatives. That's the model that most people think of when they think of a kind of a democratically based economic strategy, and that's a big part of what they do, but it's not the only part. It's things like supporting, democratizing how we finance, development, growth, business. So public banking is a big part of their agenda, which is a really important part of what we're doing. And then it's really been a big part of the climate justice and the just transition sort of conversation. Really has some deep connections to the social and solidarity economy, because leaving these decisions to powerful multinational corporations, extractive industries, has always been problematic, regardless of whether you're a resource dependent country or region of a country. And certainly having the electorate, people, citizens, participate in deciding the fate of their city, their state, their country, is not always a foregone conclusion. Certainly, we know that here. So that the movement, which it really has been a movement, has been to how do we really, I think, in simplest terms, democratize the decisions that are most fundamental to where we live, how we earn a decent, dignified existence, how we build our cities, what we invest in, and how people can have access to whatever capital and whatever finance, for example, that they need to meet their basic needs, whether they're business owners or just advocates or just working people. So the social and solidarity economy panel that you mentioned is we put together with some international experts who've been in this space for a long time. The Latin American and Iberian Institute is a long-standing kind of multidisciplinary research center and cultural center as well at the University of New Mexico. It's folks who teach all across the university, students, graduate students, lots of faculty who are anywhere connected to doing research and applied work in Latin America and Spain and Portugal, so the Iberian Peninsula, and they host a lot of community engagement in terms of arts, culture, politics, history, and this panel is a virtual panel, which means we can bring some folks from around the world, and we've invited some of the experts from around the world to talk about how this movement, the social solidarity economy movement, is playing out in Latin America. So we have Euclides Manse, who's a professor at a prominent university in Brazil, and who's written several books on what he calls economic circuits and social solidarity networks, and how do we actually institutionalize the networks that will build these, cooperative worker-based economies and much more social justice-based economies. One of my colleagues and the person who I'll be working closely with in Barcelona in Spain, where I'll be teaching next year and doing some research, is Dr. Santiago Izaguirre, who's really looked at the municipal perspective. Barcelona has been kind of an international leader on how you build an inclusive local economy. And he's going to be speaking about his work in Barcelona. And then, a lot of folks who aren't familiar with SSC in the U.S. Aren't aware that there's a pretty robust network and a research center called the Solidarity Research Center. And one of my colleagues from a lot of work I've done over the years, Yvonne Liu, who helped start the Solidarity Research Network, and they've done tons of research in how cities and states across the country in the U.S. are trying to advance initiatives that are promoting the SSC movement. And she'll be on the panel to kind of give us a U.S. perspective, and then we'll take some questions and hopefully try to educate folks, but also kind of get some good examples of how it's working here in the U.S.
You must be familiar with the Democracy Collaborative then.
Yeah, they're absolutely partners and have been in this space a very long time. And yes, they've pioneered a lot of this work and are, I think, much more like considered the mainstream part of the movement. But it's a pretty eclectic movement in the U.S. New Economy Coalition. The as I mentioned, the Solidarity Research Network. There's a lot of folks who are in this space. Lots of the cooperative movement more broadly in the U.S. So yeah, there's lots of great folks trying to work at alternatives to the sort of the neo, as I said, the neoliberal, capitalism at all costs kind of model that often permeates our politics and our kind of national identity. So we're trying to provide some alternatives. I think a lot of folks are trying to think outside the box for that.
So can you give us a couple examples of successful adoption of social and solidarity economy movement principles? That's hard to say.
Yeah, SSE is SSE. Well, I have to say, I wish there were more examples in the U.S. Now across the world, there are lots of examples. The most obvious one is, Spain's known for the Mondragon Cooperative, which is the largest worker-owned cooperative in the world, multi-billion-dollar company. They've become more, even though they're worker owned, they become more sort of capitalistic in the sense that they some of the solidarity that was built in the early days of Mondragon has dissipated some. It's still a core principle for them, but it's just proof that you can be a competitive, successful multinational corporation with lots of earnings and still have workers have a real say in how the companies run, and also more importantly share in the gains of what happens as opposed to just having shareholders to get all the benefits. So Mondragon's probably the main example. A lot of folks are also familiar with Emilia Romano, which is in Italy, which is another really long-standing worker-owned cooperative in Italy. And then there are many smaller examples across the world, some in Latin America. We do have a few fledgling examples in the U.S. Everything from folks who are trying to start cooperative networks here in the U.S. to folks who, for example, even here in New Mexico, where they're working on how do we democratize public finance by having a public bank. And I know that's something you've worked on and we've worked on together over the years with AFLEP and the folks who are working on that. And so there's lots of models of just basically trying to run our economy differently and to try to prioritize people over profits. And I think there's lots of models of that I think we can build and learn from across the world.
So let me ask you this: is there any work going on, any really significant work going on in New Mexico on this work? I mean, I know you and I were part of a small group of people that were trying to get some kind of cooperative incubator or something going, and I wound up having to drop off of that. So has that materialized into like anything like an incubator for cooperatives?
Yeah, actually, so some of the folks who we worked with in the South Valley in Albuquerque, the Cooperative Catalyst, which is a small nonprofit which tries to nurture and help worker-owned and other cooperatives, not just worker-owned cooperatives, but there's lots of ways that cooperatives work, not just worker-owned. We have financial cooperatives, we have cooperatives in the food sector, which are where we think of worker-owned farms, but there's also folks who do production cooperatives, and of course everybody thinks about energy and utility cooperatives. We are familiar with those, but anytime there are in any sector where there's a much more thoughtful approach to including workers in the decision making and also in the gains of what happens in that entity, whether it's energy or food production, right? So we helped launch. It's small, but doing good work in mostly in the South Valley, but also in a lot of Native communities. The Cooperative Catalyst, which is all at the South Valley Economic Development Center. That's where they're physically housed. We also, and I know Paul, you were part of this. We also launched a kind of a new kind kind of alternative voice for sustainable and inclusive democracy called SEED, Sustainable Economic Democracy. And they're, they've not grown exponentially in the last year, but they certainly have been important. They were part of the bringing a kind of a progressive business voice to the early childhood constitutional amendment. They're currently working on some housing issues here in Albuquerque, and they were active in the legislature a little bit on some issues. So still small, but kind of growing slowly in terms of providing another model for how we should think about economic development in particular.
Oh, I need to interrupt for just a second. I'm so fascinated by the conversation. I forgot to do our mid radio show advertisement for KSFR. We need to take a break to remind our listeners that KSFR is more important than ever during an age of rampant misinformation in the mainstream and social media, and in most political rhetoric, no matter the party. In the face of that misinformation, KSFR offers timely news and alerts and a wide range of programming to keep you informed and sane. In an era replete with misinformation, at KSFR you get the straight scoop, fact-based news from Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, the BBC, and KSFR's own state and local news. You get great music and informative discussions on timely issues like this one, and economic development, economic update with Richard Wolff, a tremendous show that comes on just before we do, every Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. So if you appreciate that kind of programming, after you finish listening to this show, please go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button and toss them 10, 20, or 50 bucks. And think of it as your ticket for admission to a wealth of great programming. On behalf of KSFR, I want to thank you for your generosity. Let's get back to Eric Greigo. Hello, Eric, we're back. And we don't have a whole ton of time, but let me ask you this. Given the significant changes in the New Mexico workforce that is going to occur when the gas and oil industry disappears, might there be an opportunity for injecting social and solidarity economy principles into the conversation? I probably should have practiced that like 50 times before we got on this stage.
It is a bit of a tongue twister. I hope so. I think the dilemma we get into often is that in our efforts to try to diversify our economy away from fossil fuels and extractive industries, we think like we'll take whatever we can get, right? So if it's a an Avangrid or a Iberdrola, ironically a Spanish company that the promise that we're going to do this great green economy, but don't talk much about like who's going to do the work and who's going to share in the gains of that, right? And what communities are going to be affected, that we're so eager to transition away that often we forget that it does matter who's running the company and what their principles are. It does matter who benefits from it. And frankly, it matters who does the work, and are they being paid fairly and rewarded for their work. And, we just sometimes assume that that's all going to work itself out. So I wish I could say, Paul, that like that's going to be a foregone conclusion, but I don't think it is. In fact, the pressures on the other side, which is if you wanna move away from these sort of dominant multinational models, you got to be willing to kind of take whatever you can get. So I think it's going to take a real conscious
another dominant international model.
Yeah, exactly right. It's going to take a real intentional effort to say, look, how we structure our economic and employment relationships is really important, and we shouldn't have, as we do in the U.S., these the gap between executives and frontline workers be in the hundreds. One of the principles in Mondragon was when they started it was never going to be more than 5 to 1. So the person running the company and the frontline worker, there was never more than a 5 to 1 difference in what they were paid. Well, that's increased in Mondragon. In some companies, it's as much as 20, but it's nowhere near the 300 times that you see in the average American corporation. And Richard Wolff talks about this all the time. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. That gap between those who do the work and those who earn the returns. We're not even talking about shareholders here. We're talking about CEOs. And so I think we have our work cut out for us to sort of just change the paradigm, the mindset about what does it mean to have a healthy company that looks at something more than just the bottom line, but it looks at how they're treating their workers and who benefits, not just from the community, but who benefits in terms of who's building the company or the organization, right, to do the right thing. And I think we have our work cut out for us on that.
So we're going to have to end the radio show here. We're going to continue this discussion, and you can get the whole discussion at retakeourdemocracy.org. Click on Retake on the Radio, and you'll find Eric and I there finishing this conversation. But before we close the show, I wanted to give Eric an opportunity to tell people where they can find out more about the about his work and also about the panel discussion that's coming up on the 13th.
Yeah, so it's April 13th. It's virtual, so you can just sign up for the Zoom. It's a noon to 1:30 over the lunch hour. And if you'll just go to the Latin American Institute at UNM, it's LAII, Latin American Iberian Institute.unm.edu. If you'll just go to their main webpage, it's the first thing that comes up, and it's there's a link there to register. And if you'll sign up, you'll get the Zoom link, and you can join us on the 13th. So laii.unm.edu.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being with me today, Eric. It's always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to getting back to the conversation. But before I do that, I got to close the radio show. And so I want to thank all our listeners for being with us. And I want to thank Eric for being with us. And I want to remind you that we'll be back next week. Not quite sure who I'll be interviewing, but we've got a couple of really good guests lined up. They're just not, it may not be next week. But in the meantime, it's critical to remain active in these times of change and challenge. Retake tries to make it easier for you to be informed and engaged, to get in the game. Go to retakeourdemocracy.org and sign up for our blog. You'll get 1 to 2 posts a week with timely analysis of politics, policy issues, and legislation with a New Mexico focus. If you want to stay on top of what's going on at the Roundhouse and when and how you can effectively weigh in, you can also sign up for our alerts, which we send out. Actually, that's Roxanne's work. She sends those out whenever one of the bills we're supporting is being called for a hearing, usually 2 or 3 days before it, so you can get to your legislators on a timely basis. We don't think last-minute emails are as effective. But that you can sign up for both of those things just at retakeourdemocracy.org. On the right side, there are a couple buttons, one for alerts and one for blog. So we'll be back next week. And while we're away, you should stay active, because if we got to stay active, it's the only way we fix this mess. Bye-bye. Okay, I'm back with Eric Greigo, and I just want to explain. Wait 1 second, I got to write this down. 27:41. Throughout the interview with Eric, for those of you who are watching this and didn't listen to it on the radio you wouldn't have known. I kept looking down at my phone, and the reason was I timed the radio show, and my phone is on battery save, and so it kept going off, and I had to keep going back on and clicking my password to see how much time I had left in the radio show. I got a spring for getting a little clock for right by the monitor so that I can do this a little more efficiently. But anyway, that's boring. Let's get back and talk with Eric. Eric's checking his phone. Let's give him a second, and we'll be right back here.
All right, I was just responding to some text there.
So let's pivot a bit and talk a little bit about the political game. You've talked a little bit about this, but the last session we did very well on a lot of things. I know your housing didn't quite get to the finish line, and nothing in relation to climate. Do you want to talk a little bit about the housing advocacy you were doing for Albuquerque?
Yeah, we so obviously, like Santa Fe, like a lot of cities, but certainly Albuquerque is kind of ground zero for the national housing crisis. And we have in Albuquerque, we have, depending on whose estimates you use and who you're talking about, we have between 20 and 30,000 units short of just to house the current demand, right? And that's across the economic spectrum. So it's a pretty big challenge. So we went up and we tried to work with the Bernalillo County and go up to the legislature and ask for substantial resources. People get sticker shock when they think of the numbers, but we were asking for 50 million, which again sounds like a lot of money, but that's in the average cost of building units, whether it's affordable housing or just renovating or repurposing existing hotels. It's that's about enough for about 500 units. So it was a drop in the bucket, but we just couldn't get there. However, a lot of legislators, individuals, and the governor kicked into several projects and pots of money. So we're still doing the accounting because, as you know, the session just wrapped up and we got to wait till Friday to see what the governor signs. But between capital and the HB2, the budget bill, and the junior bill, we think there'll be 20 or 25 million in housing related money that folks in Albuquerque and Bernalillo County will hopefully be able to take at least some part of, to try to build some affordable housing. To one of our strategies here in Albuquerque is to kind of convert to retrofit hotels into affordable housing for folks who are interested just in a kind of a studio setup where they can have the basics, but at least be able to have a place to call home, even if it's for a short period of time, for months or a year or so. So that's a big objective for us. We did get some good policy improvements. Definitely, we got some investments. If they're signed by the governor on Friday, they will include things like more support for home ownership, more support for what we call these housing stability funds, which really make it a little bit more a little safer for landlords and tenants to have a relationship in terms of rentals if they have problematic rental histories, for example. And then there's just a ton of money in the Housing Trust Fund and other places that we think will hopefully help finance big and small projects, not just in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, but across the state, for folks who need affordable housing. We didn't get some of the sort of the rent related and sort of landlord protection stuff that we were hoping. But we do think if we can find ways to increase the housing stock in Albuquerque and across the state, that hopefully will make a dent in some of the unhoused population, but also the rest of folks, young people, seniors, working folks who are just having a hard time being able to afford rent. Forget home ownership, just being able to rent a decent place and not spending more than half their income on housing. So it was mixed. It was a mixed success, but we did get some substantial investment in housing, the in-house population. We got an investment in our Gateway Center and some housing and homelessness programs that we think will be helpful for those who are really at the margin. So we're hopeful, but it's certainly not everything we would have liked to have seen in terms of the capital and the budget, so on.
Well, one thing I've noticed at the legislature is that we really don't have very many strong, progressive, principled legislators who are strident advocates. They may have, be liberal and be willing to vote for certain things, but they really need a lot of education sometimes to understand the full picture. What would you say about, like, if it seems to me, you were talking earlier, you were talking a bit about how on the city council, when you were on the city council, you had that critical mass of progressives so you could get something done. In Albuquerque, it's an urban environment. You're not but you have mixes of rural communities too. How do you go about forming that kind of progressive majority, not Democratic majority, but progressive majority in a state with so many rural communities that don't necessarily have instinctive progressive instincts?
Well, I think not unlike the country, Paul, and I know you've talked a lot about this and I know thought a lot about it. We're a pretty rural state still, but the overwhelming majority of the population in the state is in the 5 biggest cities, right? So they all, with the couple of exceptions, tend to lean toward more democratic and progressive sort of values. So out between Albuquerque and Santa Fe and Las Cruces, I think we have close to in the greater metropolitan area here in Albuquerque and Cruces and Santa Fe, we're getting pretty close to 1 million people, and that's almost half the population. Now, Rio Rancho is a little bit of an anomaly because they tend to be a little bit more kind of moderate. I'll put it that way. But so I think what's happening is with the changes in the urban development, right, in the bigger cities, that we're tending to elect, and this has happened in Albuquerque, much more progressive folks. And if the cities continue to grow, if we're not sort of de-urbanizing and folks moving out to more rural areas, I think there's a shot of the state, that wave continuing. Our legislature has gotten certainly a lot more progressive when I was up there. I know we're still disappointed in some of the outcomes, but it's a lot more progressive than it was 10 years ago, and certainly much more than 20 years ago. So as the state changes and folks, more young people, more people, for example, in the film industry, more folks who care about the environment, start to live near and in urban areas like Albuquerque and Cruces and Santa Fe, and I think surrounding areas, I hope that we will get to be more and more blue, which means we hopefully will be more and more progressive. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion, and I still think the power centers are still, as you know, because you've done this work, is there's some powerful industries that aren't necessarily progressive, oil and gas being principal among them. We still have a heavy dependence on sort of national security and military related, investment that has most of those folks have a certain political bent as well. So, but I do think the state's in transition. I think we're moving in a more progressive direction. I can't say that for Albuquerque. We have a little bit of an anomaly right now. We have a kind of a 9-member council. We have a progressive mayor, but a 9-member council that does not lean progressive. In fact, it's sort of moderate at best, but 5 Democrats, 4 Republicans. But our city council in the biggest city in the state still is, I think, fairly conservative compared to Las Cruces, certainly compared to Santa Fe. So we have our work cut out for us at the municipal level in Albuquerque for sure.
Well, something to keep busy with. So I understand that you're transitioning from the mayor's office. Before we started the radio show, you told me that you were moving to Spain. Congratulations. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I've been extradited. No, I got just as you know, I went back and finished a dissertation and a PhD I'd been working on for way too long. But I finally finished up and wanted to make sure that I actually put some of those skills to use. So I applied for a Fulbright Scholar program just right after I finished my dissertation, and then went to work with the city and sort of hoped for the best. And so for the last year, I've been just working on helping address the problems here in Albuquerque, and just found out a couple of weeks ago that I was selected to be a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Barcelona in Catalonia in Spain, at a research center that does really interesting and progressive research around what is the role of cities in this whole movement toward a much more democratically based economy, a much more thoughtful, just transition around climate, a much more inclusive housing policy that doesn't sort of accept the kind of numbers we have on the streets in most American cities. So really smart people who are thoughtful. I'm hoping to learn a lot from this multidisciplinary team that's in Barcelona. And besides being a beautiful city, they're a super progressive city, right? They've got the mayor, Ada Colau, who's kind of an international leader in the municipalist movement and the fearless cities movement, is really pushing cities to take the lead in pushing progressive policies, because like increasingly, as you know, cities are where we can make the most progress, because certainly Congress sometimes is not the place that real progressive change is happening, and even in state legislatures, it's harder to make things happen. But cities are really, I think, the most nimble and the most sort of on the front lines, as we often say, and we can make some real progressive change around economic development, around housing, around climate. So I'm hoping to learn from what Barcelona has been able to do, and hopefully bring some of that back, I hope. And we'll see how receptive folks are when I get back. So
come back with all that information and run for governor.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think my political days are over, but I'll be happy to advise some good candidates. That'd be good. I'll give them some ideas for a platform. That's for sure.
So you mentioned Barcelona and the mayor there. Isn't she part of something like Fearless Cities? I think you mentioned that to me before. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Ada Colau, Mayor Colau of Barcelona, she kind of came up as a kind of a housing activist. Barcelona, like a lot of kind of touristy cities, had a kind of affordable housing crisis, and she came out as an activist, and became really popular and was pretty fearless herself, got elected mayor, and helped launch a new kind of political party called Barcelona Comú, which is sort of a coalition of left parties that were really socially conscious, democratic socialist sort of in philosophy. And her ideas permeated a lot of European cities and a lot of cities around the world in terms of this ethos of economic democracy, right? And the population and average citizens in a city being able to have a lot more influence into how they were growing and how they were investing their money and how they were making decisions around housing and all these issues. So her work also helped launch some pretty major national changes in Spain, including launching some bigger parties that are also have similar ethos ideologies, like the Podemos party, which helped launch the current kind of progressive democratic socialist leadership in Spain. So Spain itself is, being led by a much more progressive coalition than certainly we have anywhere in the U.S., but even in most parts of Europe. So she was part of that, and she's going to be up for election. So I'll get to sort of see how a local election of a really kind of forward-looking, socially conscious mayor does. And ironically, she's being challenged from the left because she's had to kind of moderate her own views a bit, from what I understand. And so the good news is I'll be able to watch another local election, even if I'll miss this next round here in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. So
when do you leave for Spain?
Trying to get everything wrapped up and be on the ground by no later than August 1st. But if we can get out there earlier, we're going to try to get out there earlier. My family's coming with me, my wife and my son, and we're all going to sort of try to make it a good learning experience for all of us, and try to, hopefully get a break from some of the craziness in the U.S. and our beloved homeland. But it also be nice to get a break from some of the U.S. Politics and certainly some of the challenges our country's facing, and maybe get a refresh. Who knows?
Well, I told you before we got on that Roxanne and I think we have planned a trip to Spain every year after the legislative session for 5 or 6 years and have not made it yet. We haven't been to Europe or on vacation since our honeymoon 13 years ago.
Wow.
And we're going to do it. And now we have one more reason to come to Spain.
Yeah, you better look us up, and I will be there. I'm telling all our friends and family, if you're headed anywhere near there, please look us up, and we'd love to host folks and show them around and give them some make sure it's a good experience. And for those who are politically inclined, to make sure they get a good sense of what's happening on the ground, because that's what I'm going to be spending time talking to a lot of candidates and parties and a lot of folks involved in the cooperative movement, and just kind of how are things playing out on the ground in this kind of progressive, fearless city. So I hope to see you there at some point over the next year, Paul.
I plan to. I definitely do. And I've never done a Zoom with someone from in another country, but after you've been there for a while and gotten your feet on the ground and sort of sorted through what's going on there, we'd love to have a conversation about what you found and what you're doing.
Yeah, I'd love to do it. We're doing so the event we talked about on the radio show, the SS Social Solidarity Economy kind of panel. So we have one of the folks who's going to be kind of heading up the research team that I'll be working on, Dr. Isaguirre, who's going to be zooming in from Spain at noon New Mexico time, which is about 7:00 p.m. Spanish time. And so we're hoping we won't have any tech issues. We also have a professor from Brazil, Euclides Manse, who's going to be, they're not as, they're only a few hours difference, zooming in. And then of course we have a West Coast person who will be just an hour ahead of us. So it'll be a good experiment on international virtual zooming, and hopefully it all will go well. I'm not running tech, thankfully, but it should be a good conversation in several time zones. So hopefully it'll be a success, but I hope folks can tune into that. I think it'll be good.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time, Eric. I really appreciate it. I did have one last question for you that was supposed to be earlier in terms of a thematic flow, but I got flustered when I couldn't get the pages to turn. The entire cooperative model runs counter to long-held American values of individualism and self-sufficiency. But to survive climate catastrophes and to achieve anything like economic justice, we are going to have to begin to think in terms of us, not me. How do we achieve a broad commitment to we as opposed to me, and to the public as opposed to the private? Easy
Wow.
question to close with.
Yeah. Well, I got to say that is the question, Paul, and I think it is the biggest challenge we as American, yeah, as people in the U.S. face. I don't like to say Americans because America is the whole hemisphere, obviously. So, um, the what I learned in Mondragon was, and maybe it was because the Basque culture was so communal, right? But and whether it's Emilia Romano and in Italy, or the communities even in the U.S. who've been able to sort of achieve some success, is this idea that that we are that it is not law of the jungle, that we have a common good, that we have a common future, that we have, and if we don't think of it as a community challenge, both to succeed together, but also to help each other when things are going tough, then it just we're all gonna sort of sink together, right? And so so this rugged individualism, or the American exceptionalism, whatever you want to call it, this idea that we're different and that we can somehow figure it out, we can crack the code to being successful without thinking about how it affects those around us. It just has proven historically not to work. And I'm not saying the Europeans or anybody else has this down, but they have at least been much more open, whether you want to call it social democrats or democratic socialists, or just folks who think that our fate is inextricably tied to each other. They seem to be more open to it. That doesn't make them better people. That just makes them maybe have a different experience about what we think of as the common good. I hope that some of that will rub off on us as we confront this climate crisis. But I'm trying to be a half glass, half full guy. But I got to say, the more I see this sort of turn toward more, kind of law of the jungle, every man for himself, culture that we often have in this country, I'm concerned for our country, for our future, for my family. I'm really concerned that we just don't get it.
I just read a really powerful book, The Parable of the Sower. I don't know if you've heard of it, but
I
Octavia
have.
Butler.
I've not read it, but I've heard of it. Yes.
You've got to read it, and it gives you a picture, a very vivid picture of where we're headed if we don't learn to cooperate with each other and deal with this climate crisis. Basically, the guy I had on last week, Robert Jensen, was very interesting. He spoke about how the game is over in terms of climate change. It just is, and it's incumbent on people and families to start thinking in terms of survival, and how that's going to play out. And I brought up the parable of the sowers, rather, because in that book, it's post-climate collapse. Like, the U.S. economy is collapsed and the government is semi-functioning, but and a Republican, real conservative Republican with the slogan "Make America Great Again" is elected president. He's a Christian. She wrote this in 1980.
Wow.
And what winds up happening is, urban centers just disintegrate. There's no local controls and government, and it's just bands of gangs and people just trying to, in small groups, trying to cling together and survive, and just walking up California, up the highways, and being attacked by marauders who are just looking for food and water. And it's a terrifying picture. But what Robert Jensen talks about is that he feels like it's time for people to start thinking in terms of buying some land or getting some land and getting friends and tools and family and learning how to survive in a sustainable way. And, it's a scary thought. And after the fact, after the interview, it occurred to me that there's like 1-2% of the population that can do that. And then what does that do for the rest of them? They're the ones wandering around the highways just looking for food. I don't know. I mean, but his point was, we have to, as a transition to that, we have to start just thinking in a more collaborative, collegial, cooperative way. And one of the things I thought about in terms of legislative policy that would be a good idea is there was a bill about developing resilience strategies around water, local water resilience strategies. And I think we need to do the same thing about local climate resilience strategies. As one of the things that Jensen made clear is that for cooperation to work and for people to believe in cooperation, you have to have a sense of we. And when you're in a big society, you don't have that sense of we. And so he was saying that much more local strategies on that, where you get, small communities together and they say, okay, if this happens, this is what we do, and this is how we help each other and start building in those relationships and so forth. So anyway, that may be the retake bill of the future.
Well, good luck. I hope we can move a bill like that. Again, I'm trying to be positive about it, but with every year, I get more and more concerned about the future of not just our country, but of the species and of the planet, because I don't know what it's going to take for us to sort of make the kind of change we need to make at a personal level, but as a community level, and certainly as a nation. So
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. And Roxanne was telling me just before we got on the radio that she was reading an article, I think it was in the New York Times morning newsletter, that was about how even in Denmark and Norway, their gas and oil exploration is increasing dramatically. Certainly in the United States it is, but it's all over the world. It's like we all know that we're killing ourselves and we keep doing it. And there's just doesn't seem to be any sense of maybe we should rethink this paradigm. And I when I read the book, This Changes Everything. Did you read that by Naomi Klein?
yeah, of course.
Okay, so when I read that, I thought, that's it. This is going to change it. People are going to get it. We have to cooperate. We can't continue to just exploit the third world and expect them to be okay with it. And we're destroying the planet. And those two movements were going to, in her book, were what had to happen. They had to intersect. And then when people started getting the sense that we're all interconnected, they would recognize it from a climactic and an economic perspective and start fixing things. But it hasn't changed anything, unfortunately, except maybe a few million people who read the book, their understanding of the dynamic, but it didn't move the envelope. So
And
I
some
share
people
your
are, yeah,
pessimism.
some people argue it's made people more cynical, so that if this is the path that we're on, that it's actually turned them toward more sort of like this, like, well, I better take care of my own and myself. And so why am I, it's that whole tragedy of the commons, say, like, why am I trying to conserve? Why am I, transitioning away from fossil fuels and trying to recycle and trying to do all these right things when really nobody's doing it. It's this idea that, like, if things are this bad and it still doesn't change our basic sort of decision making, then it really does become kind of every person, man for himself, every woman for herself, and that's the fear I have, is that folks are just so incredibly discouraged by where we are as a species that it really is bringing out the worst in all of us, right? Like, I'm just gonna take care of my own, and whatever that looks like, right? And that's frightening. That's dystopian and frightening to me, is that it's bringing out the worst in our politics. And it's not just an American phenomenon, as you know, Paul, like this faux populism that some folks around the world are using to sort of mask this hyper capitalist and extractive kind of mindset. I think it's it's frightening. It's frightening, and I keep hoping for that shift in our collective psyche. And I don't know. I'm not giving up hope yet, but I have to say I'm not holding my breath at the moment. So
Yeah, there's a book I've wanted to write for 5 years now called Connecting the Dots. I've often thought that, what happens with people is suddenly there's a connection between all these things that have happened to them in their lives, in their communities' lives and everything. And it all comes together and you kind of go, oh, I get it. I see how we're getting screwed, blah, blah, blah. And yet I don't have the bandwidth or the energy. I'm 72 in 2 weeks, 72. So I might as well enjoy 71 while I'm still there. But it's that writing a book is no easy chore, as you know, because writing a dissertation is about the same thing. But it just seems like at some point the light has to go on and people have to see that this is just leading us to hell. But it doesn't seem to be clicking anywhere. And I don't see what the message is. that's going to generate that shift.
No, I share your concern. I think about in this country, I think about the gun issue. Like every time we think that this will be the tipping point, this will be the thing that changes it, and here we are once again. And I think we hear that over and over with climate. The next round, the news gets worse every time we hear a new study. And instead of rallying the troops, instead as you said, even outside the U.S., people say, well, okay, how do we find new ways to explore and to generate more sort of extractive sort of energy? And I don't know. I think there's just maybe this delusion that we're going to sort of innovate ourselves out of it. I've heard people talk about that, like we're somehow going to innovate our way out of this crisis. And maybe that's true, but I think that's a very risky strategy for our
It's
speed.
also relying on the same hubris that got us here. It's like
Yep.
we can manipulate nature and the world to our liking. And the people who believe about that, that our innovation will save us, are those who refuse to let go of all their capitalist toys and capitalist advantage, and figure that it's only through innovation that they continue to do that. And it's still a finite planet, and we can't make it infinite, and so we can't grow infinitely, and so capitalism can't work long term. And at some point, people have to understand that. But when I can I can think of conversations I've had with very progressive people who would, if I start talking anti-capitalist, they start saying, well, wait a minute, everything I have, I got through capitalism.
Yep.
And my reply is, and everything this earth got, we got through capitalism. And so hang on.
Yep.
So anyway, all right, I could talk to you all day, Eric.
Yeah. Well,
You probably have some things to do, and if
yeah,
we
I'm just in time to jump on to my next meeting, but it's great to see you, and thanks for having me on, and
good to see
hopefully
you too.
we'll get to see you in person before too
In
long.
Spain, in
Yeah,
Spain.
in Spain or even in Santa Fe, who knows?
Okay, well, let me know if you're going to be up here, and we'll get together.
Sounds good.
All
Sounds
right,
good.
take care,
Take care,
Eric.
Paul. Good
All
to
right,
see
bye
you.
bye.